The Enneagram has a fascinating and mysterious background. The symbol of the Enneagram, this strange circle with all kinds of lines going through it, I like to tell people it's not a satanic symbol. It's an ancient symbol. It's something that has been found back in the rocks and the bricks of Iran and Iraq 6,000 years ago. So it's got some very ancient origins that really aren't very well understood. There are some fascinating parallels between the Enneagram and Homer's Odyssey, for example. There were 9 mythic lands that were a part of this Odyssey that Homer captured. And the Enneagram types walk through those lands in the same order that you would find in the Enneagram. There are parallels in Dante's comedy. The 9 aspects of hell. There are 9 aspects of purgatory. There are 9 aspects of heaven. Fascinating. So this Enneagram was a part of a perennial knowledge and wisdom that goes way back. And there are even back in the 4th century of the Christian mystics, there was the notion of the 8 passions, or also called the root sins, back in the time. For some reason, they left off fear, which is one of the 9 passions that I'll be introducing you to. So it was a part of that perennial understanding in the Christian mythology and mysticism. And then there are some clear parallels with some of the ancient Sufi spirituality, with Egyptian spirituality, the Jewish Kabbalah. There are all of these overlapping threads that we find in the Enneagram. And then as we bring it into more modern times, there was a man named George Gurdjieff, who was born near the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, who really is seen to be the person who probably brought it from the East into the West. He was somebody who framed the journey of life as moving from a kind of sleepwalking into an awakeness. And he utilized this triad of head, heart, and body, and even integrated it into dance forms. So he's somebody that seemed to be a major figure in sort of the early foundations of the Enneagram. And then, as we find the roots becoming a little bit more established, we go to a man named Oscar Ichazo, who was in Chile. He developed the Enneagram as a program of psychological and spiritual development, and probably did that in the 50s and 60s. So you can start to hear how the Enneagram is really a remarkably new kind of development and understanding in some ways, and it has some very ancient roots in other ways. And then it eventually made its way to the United States, and of course, like a lot of strange things, it starts in California. And that was brought to the United States by a man named Claudia Naranjo, who had studied with Oscar Ichazo, probably in the early 70s. And he came to California in the early 70s with this knowledge of the Enneagram, and he really further developed it as a psychological typology. And he met with a small group of people, I think 7 or 8 people, some of whom are still very active today. And it was a group, they were instructed not to make any of this public. And they studied this thing called the Enneagram. And eventually, it came into more public awareness. But what I find to be so fascinating is that the Enneagram stayed in this sort of oral tradition, not spoken about, not brought into print even until the 1980s. And we know that Helen Palmer, who was really one of the forebears of the Enneagram in this country, was one of the very first to publish descriptions of the Enneagram. Since then, the Enneagram has really, really taken off. There was a quote in Newsweek magazine that says, now lurking on the fringes of mysticism and pop psychology for more than 20 years, the Enneagram is turning mainstream and respectable. So this thing that has been so mysterious and kind of lurking in the corners of perennial wisdom has really blossomed into public awareness since the 1980s. And it's now being utilized in schools of business, medical schools. Apparently, they've utilized it in the CIA and the Postal Service, the Vatican. There are all kinds of corporations that are now using the Enneagram. And it's because it is, again, on that one level, it's a powerful kind of diversity training. But on a much deeper level, the Enneagram opens us up to this whole other way of being in the world that is life that Rumi talks about.